Today's video is sponsored by Nobility.co.uk, the leading company in selling legal titles in the United Kingdom. Get a 10% discount in any purchase by mentioning Death Row. Born September 25, 1948, in Whittier, California, Jimmy Lee Gray. At the age of 18, Jimmy murdered his girlfriend Elda Louise Prince. 16-year-old Elda was a sophomore at Parker High School in Parker, Arizona, where Jimmy was also a student and a school friend of Elda's brother, 18-year-old Irvin. The Prince family had made Jimmy welcome in their house and even helped out by buying him clothes. They also took him to ball games and on fishing trips. On the day of the murder, January 5, 1968, Elda was to leave school early for a doctor's appointment and her mother, Opal, was going to the doctor's office to pick her up at 4:30 p.m. The receptionist told her that Elda had not shown up, so Opal went home presuming that her daughter had caught the school bus as usual. When this arrived without her, Opal called the police and reported her daughter missing. Jimmy went with the Princes to the sheriff's office and later that evening helped in the search for Elda. The sheriff was suspicious of Jimmy, having noticed his shoes, and under questioning the following day he led deputies to a culvert near the Colorado River and showed them where he had dumped her body. The shoes pattern exactly matched the prints at the crime scene. Examination showed that the Elda had been strangled and had her throat cut before being thrown into the culvert. It appeared that Jimmy had met Elda after school, and that walking home they had quarreled and he had killed her. Elda was buried in the Cottonwood Cemetery on the 11th of January. Jimmy was convicted of second-degree murder and received a sentence of 20 years to life. Sadly, he was released on parole after just 6 years, despite the protest of the trial judge who regarded him as a dangerous individual. How right he would be proved to be. Nothing much was heard of Jimmy until June 25, 1976. After release from prison he had moved. On that day, 3-year-old Daisa Jean Scales disappeared from her parents' apartment in Pascagoula, Mississippi. They reported her disappearance to the police around 5 p.m. that afternoon. Jimmy lived in the same apartment complex as the Scales and was questioned by police after neighbors mentioned that they had seen Daisa with a man with a red Volkswagen car, whom they identified as living in the apartments. When Jimmy showed up in the car, police noted that the lower legs of his jeans were wet, which he explained by his having been swimming in the complex's pool. Under questioning, he admitted to them that he had taken Daisa for a ride in the country, and that on a back road had touched the little girl. He claimed that she had wandered off and fallen into a shallow ditch. He rescued her from the ditch and put her, still breathing, into the trunk of his car. He then began the homeward journey, stopping on a bridge over Black Creek, where he removed Daisa from the trunk and threw her into the water below. Once again he led police to the crime scene at 3:30 a.m. the following morning. The medical examiner found that Daisa had been gagged, sodomized, her underpants forced down her throat, and finally suffocated by being held face down in the mud in the ditch. Mud was found to have been inhaled. Jimmy Lee Gray was convicted of murdering 3-year-old girl after kidnapping and sodomized her in 1976. Jimmy came to trial in Pascagoula on December 13, 1976, before Judge Merrill, charged with first-degree murder and sodomy. Once again, shoe prints would help convict the presence of semen in the little girl's body, although at that time DNA was not sufficiently advanced to enable it to be linked to Jimmy. It took jurors just an hour to convict Jimmy, and he was then sentenced to death in the gas chamber. Gray was convicted of capital murder under Mississippi Code 97-3-19. That statute applies by its terms to both intentional and unintentional killings that occur during the commission of certain felonies. Therefore, Gray argues that we must address the ticklish question whether capital punishment for an unintentional killing comports with Eighth Amendment standards. It is undisputed that at the sentencing phase of Gray's bifurcated trial, the jury found beyond a reasonable doubt that Gray had killed Daisa Scales for the purpose of avoiding arrest. This finding is equivalent to a finding of intent. Taking a human life for a deliberate and particular purpose, such as to avoid arrest, is necessarily intentional murder. For this reason, it was a firm earlier conclusion that we need not reach the difficult question of constitutional law posed by capital punishment for an unintentional killing. Gray's second contention is that, in sentencing him, the jury should have been required to find beyond a reasonable doubt that the attendant aggravating circumstances outweighed the mitigating circumstances. On this point, persuaded by the reasoning of our sister circuit, which recently addressed this issue, seriously confuses proof of facts and the weighing of facts in sentencing. While the existence of an aggravating or mitigating circumstance is a fact susceptible to proof under a reasonable doubt or preponderance standard, the relative weight is not. The process of weighing circumstances is a matter for judge and jury, and, unlike facts, is not susceptible to proof by either party. On September 1, 1983, the U.S. Supreme Court dismissed Jimmy's final appeals in a 6-3 decision, so clearing the way for his execution the following day, Friday, September 2, 1983, at the Mississippi State Penitentiary. Chief Justice Warren B. Burger said, "This case illustrates the recent pattern of calculated efforts to frustrate valid judgments after painstaking judicial review over a number of years. At some point there must be finality." Mississippi State Penitentiary is generally known as Parkman, after its first warden, J.M. Parkman. An execution date was set for Jimmy Lee Gray on September 2, 1983. Jimmy's mother, Verna Smith, who was living in California, urged the state of Mississippi to execute her son. And Jimmy Lee Gray was executed by asphyxiation gas in Mississippi on September 2, 1983 at about 8:30 p.m. On Thursday, September 1, 1983, evening, Jimmy received Holy Communion from several ministers. He had earlier had a final meal of Mexican food. 3 hours before the execution, members of the Mississippi Coalition Against the Death Penal held a peaceful candlelight protests outside the gates of the prison and outside the governor's mansion in Jackson. At 12:01 a.m. Central Daylight Time, Warden Eddie Lucas gave the order to staff to commence the execution procedure. At 12:08, Jimmy was brought into the 20-foot x 12-foot, white-painted execution room wearing a red death row jumpsuit, and strapped into the gas chamber's perforated steel chair with the head of a bull's stethoscope taped to his chest. The heavy door was closed and sealed, and at 12:12, the gas was released. When Mississippi's executioner, T. Barry Bruce, operated the lever to lower the cyanide pellets into the vat of sulfuric acid below the seat of the death's chair. At this time the head restraint shown in the photo was not present, but the metal pole behind the chair was. 15 official witnesses, including 4 journalists, watched the execution and noted 11 gasps, followed by moans and a single loud groan. Jimmy appeared to gulp down the gas, as had no doubt been instructed to do to hasten his death. He strained against the restraining straps and his head slumped forward, then violently backwards, hitting the metal pole with such force as to rattle the whole apparatus. At the time of Gray's execution, The gas chamber used in Mississippi had a vertical steel pole directly behind the inmate's chair. There was no headrest or strap used to restrain Gray's head. The exact time of death is disputed. Prison officials claimed that Jimmy suffered cardiac arrest at 12:15 a.m. But the witnesses saw that he was still gasping for breath and convulsing 8 minutes later when they were asked to leave the witness area. According to the execution log, all movement had apparently ceased by 12:21 a.m., 9 minutes after the execution began. His attorney, Dennis Balsk, told reporters that Jimmy had suffered a painful death. This was the second execution in the USA in 1983 and the 8th since the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of capital punishment in 1976. Thank you for watching Death Row.